My daughter told me that I had killed her mother, and I told 180 people who were at the wedding about it. Caroline came on stage in an outfit that cost $15,000. She said in front of everyone that I was a pitiful loser who let his mother die because I didn't have enough money to save her. That mother left after years of being ashamed because of the man she married. Even though her father had let her down, she was glad that her new husband's family was rich. None of the words were true, they were all lies. I was sitting in the back corner of table 12, watching her as she ruined 8 years of my silence. The Sterlings agreed by moving their heads up and down. People who worked with them in the hedge fund business smiled at each other with smug looks on their faces. No one paid any attention to the sad man, no one even looked at him. I took a careful sip of the water and then set the glass down lightly because Caroline didn't know that my Chase account had $33 million in it. She was about to find out the hard way why it's not a good idea to make the silent person in the corner angry. I'll believe you when you say that the next thing that happens is something I'll want to see. Let me tell you how we got here. After my mother died, it's possible that my daughter could try to take advantage of the tragedy to get social points. Matt Thompson is my name. I am 62 years old. For 30 years, I worked as a military contractor and was an expert in sensitive defense technologies. People who work in employment of the sort need a top-secret security clearance and have to be very careful about how much money they make, but they get paid a lot. My wife, Margaret, and I raised Caroline in a small 3-bedroom house in Stamford, Connecticut. We chose to go to the Jersey Shore for our vacations instead of going to Europe. We went to Target to get our groceries and drove about in old automobiles. The truth is that this wasn't because we didn't have enough money, it was because Margaret thought it was important to teach our kid the value of money. She often told Caroline not to spoil her with money. First, she needs to work on her character. Margaret was the teacher for the kindergarten classes. 28 years of working at the same elementary school, making $45,000 a year. She could have quit at any point after my defense contract started making a lot of money, but she really cared about those kids. Being a teacher kept her in touch with reality. Caroline had no idea how much money we had. She thought her father was just a guy who did computer-related work for the government. My mom was a teacher. When things were rough, our finances were okay, or maybe even a little below average. Everything changed, though, starting in 2014. During a normal self-examination, Margaret discovered a lump in her breast. The oncologist told us that if we followed standard treatment, we would only have about 18 months to live. I didn't want to settle for maybe as an alternative. I threw away everything I owned. I sold my shares in the 3 military companies that I had helped start. I got paid $2.3 million a year for my consulting work with the Pentagon. I've used up all of my military-related medical contacts. We got immunotherapy as part of a clinical trial that was going on at Johns Hopkins. Every treatment cycle, clinical trials in Switzerland cost $180,000. At Mass General, proton beam radiation costs $40,000 for the consultation and $95,000 for each session. Caroline watched me write check after check. We found out that large amounts of money had been taken out of our savings account after looking over the statements. She told her friends, "Dad is spending everything he has to save Mom." She was right when she said this. People often saw her getting rid of the house where we had lived for 15 years so she could pay for therapies that insurance didn't cover. Over the course of 24 months, the total amount of the medical bills grew to $2,100,000. We didn't have a single dime left in any of our accounts after they were all emptied. Caroline, on the other hand, didn't see this. The money that is coming back 3 months later, after Margaret had been diagnosed with the sickness, I was given the greatest cyber defense project the military had ever done and given to a single contractor. Over the course of 5 years, $47.5 million was completely sordid. My own family didn't even know the details. My business, which is in the defense industry, went public 6 months after I first thought about doing so. I was told that I sold my original investment, but it was truly turned into shares. But I couldn't buy these shares until the lockup period after the initial public offering was over. When the shares were first sold, they were worth $31.2 million. Northrop Grumman bought another firm a year later. I had helped them set up security processes. My consulting agreement had a clause that included back-end royalties that started as soon as specified revenue goals were met. The check was for $18,700,000. By the end of 2015, when Margaret went into hospice care, I had more money than I ever thought I would. But I couldn't tell her this. I couldn't tell Caroline. The Pentagon could spend whatever money it wanted on the contracts until the programs were finished in 2019. On January 15, 2016, Margaret passed away. Caroline was 25 years old. At the wake, she went up to the crowd and gave a speech about how far her father had gone to try to save her mother. She also talked about how her family had lost their money and possessions. Mother, on the other hand, knew how much father cared for her, at least. I let her keep thinking that. For 8 years, I made Caroline believe that we were broke. I made her believe that her father was a failure who had wasted all of his money and couldn't save her mother. She got a job in marketing and made $65,000 a year. Paid $2,800 a month to rent a studio apartment in Manhattan. I started dating men who worked in finance and consulting and made a lot of money. In the meantime, I went on with my life as if I didn't have any money. I bought a little condo in Stamford for $180,000 in cash, but I lied to Caroline and told her I was renting it. I owned a 2012 Honda Civic and drove it around for many years. Caroline would go to the same Target and eat at the same diners as everyone else, but every month her school loans would go less in a peculiar way. The uncertainty about her credit card payments was fixed using unknown ways. As soon as she told her landlord that she intended to move into a better apartment, she would get an anonymous cashier's check in the mail for the amount of the security deposit. She never questioned the situations that were just coincidences. In 2019, she started dating Reginald Sterling, who worked as an analyst at a hedge fund. 3 generations before he was born, his family made their money by investing in railroads. They owned a mansion in Greenwich with 12 bedrooms, drove matching Range Rovers, and spent their summers in the Hamptons. At that moment, Caroline was the happiest person in the world. She had finally found a boyfriend who was smart and cultured. The Sterlings have looked down on me since the first day we met. During family dinners, they would talk about how lucky Caroline was to be a member of their family and how she came from a working-class background. Whitman Sterling Jr., Reginald's father, informed me during Christmas dinner that he really liked how I made the most of what I had. I thanked him with a smile for being so understanding. Caroline, on the other hand, didn't know what her mother had really spoken about her in the last few weeks of her life. The talks we had with each other when morphine made Margaret very honest about what kind of person our daughter really was. She was going to learn the hard way that you should never think that the person in the corner who isn't talking can't use the nuclear option. In 2019, she started dating Reginald Sterling, who works as an analyst at a hedge fund. 3 generations before he was born, his family made their money by investing in railroads. They owned a mansion in Greenwich with 12 bedrooms, drove matching Range Rovers, and spent their summers in the Hamptons. At that moment, Caroline was the happiest person in the world. She had finally found a boyfriend who was smart and cultured. The Sterlings have looked down on me since the first day we met. During family dinners, they would talk about how lucky Caroline was to be a member of their family and how she came from a working-class background. Whitman Sterling Jr., Reginald's father, informed me during Christmas dinner that he really liked how I made the most of what I had. I thanked him with a smile for being so understanding. Caroline, on the other hand, didn't know what her mother had really spoken about her in the last few weeks of her life. The talks we had with each other when morphine made Margaret very honest about what kind of person our daughter really was. She was going to learn the hard way that you should never think that the quiet person in the corner can't use the nuclear option. Caroline's marriage to John was even better than she had hoped it would be. The Ashworth Estate Country Club is one possible location. It is close to Greenwich and costs $85,000 a day to reserve, however this price is only for one day. There are 180 guests, all dressed in expensive clothes and drinking champagne from a $200 bottle. The suit I picked to wear was the one I had been saving for a particular event. The outfit was from Men's Warehouse and was a navy blue color. It was the most expensive suit I owned, costing $200, and I had it for 6 years. Caroline had told me not to humiliate her by trying to hire something expensive. The ceremony was quite nice. Caroline was so happy when she put on the Vera Wang dress that costs $15,000. Reginald looked like he had just come out of a Ralph Lauren magazine. He wore a tuxedo that was made just for him and cost $4,000. I escorted her down the aisle and put her hand in the hand of the man she loved. When the photographer asked me to look proud of my daughter, I couldn't help but grin. I was proud the whole time, even as dinner was being made and served. The Sterlings were the ones who put me at table number 12. It is at the back corner of the room where people check in, next to the doors to the kitchen. Reginald's great-aunt, who was deaf in one ear, was sitting at my table with a few distant cousins who plainly had the worst seats. Caroline's table was in the middle of the room, where it stood out the most. There were white orchids on the head table, which were worth $500. She ended up sitting between Reginald and his dad. She fit in with the group since she laughed at their jokes. I was eavesdropping on people who were talking during the cocktail hour. Reginald and his friends from Princeton were talking about their vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard. Investment bankers are unhappy about the $60,000 a year they pay for their kids to go to private school. At the same time, hedge fund managers are talking about their Ferraris. One of the groomsmen asked Caroline how she had gotten away from her problems because she was a friend of Reginald. She laughed and replied, "I guess they're good genes with better taste." But the best part of the occasion didn't happen until Caroline got up to give her speech. She made a noise by hitting the flute that held her champagne with a knife made of silver. There was no noise in the room. The beautiful bride, dressed in her perfect gown, drew the attention of 180 people who were grateful for her beauty. Caroline's voice filled the room as she talked. "Good evening, everyone," she said. "I want to add, all of you are welcome here, as this is the most important day of my life, which is what people generally say in a wedding speech." People are both clapping and smiling. I could never have imagined that I would wind up in a place like this when I was still growing up. I never thought I would marry such an amazing man from such a wealthy family and be surrounded by all of you wonderful people. More clapping. I drank a little bit of my water. I must be completely honest with all of you. As a child, I didn't have an easy time. She stopped and looked me straight in the eye before continuing with my father. No matter how hard he tried, my father never really accomplished anything important. The room got quieter. A couple other folks looked at the table where I was sitting with unpleasant looks. He changed after my mother died. Let's just say that the loss didn't bring out the best in him. He lost practically all hope that he would be able to succeed, live, and take care of his family. I carefully set my glass of water down on the table and then folded my hands in my lap. Reginald said, "I don't like to admit this, but there were times when I was embarrassed by his lack of ambition, his humble beginnings, and the fact that he was happy to be average instead of working hard to improve himself." His father nodded in agreement. Several members of the Sterling family looked at each other and seemed to understand how the other felt about the situation. I would lie awake every night and think about what my mother would think if she could see how far Dad had fallen after she died, and if she would be ashamed of the man she married. At that moment, I felt a chill in the area around my heart. Caroline was using Margaret's memories to turn me into a weapon in front of 180 people. On the other hand, I was lucky to run into Reginald. He is the reason I know about this family. A family that taught me what real success looks like, what it means to have standards, and how to go after something that gives your life meaning. She tapped her glass lightly against the table of the Sterling family. Patricia Whitman, thank you for letting me be a part of your family and for showing me that it is possible to get through tough times. To show that the choices you make every day shape your breeding and rank, not just the way you were born. Side of the crowd, the Sterling side, stood up and clapped. Here's to fresh starts, putting the past behind you, and finally having a father figure in your life who has really done something. Whitman Sterling Jr. smiled back at her like someone had just given him a trophy. Raise a glass to my true father, who is sitting at table 12. He did the best he could with what he had, even though it wasn't much. A few individuals actually laughed. I made fun of the sad old man who was wearing the cheapest suit and couldn't even buy a nice table for his daughter's wedding. Caroline raised her glass again. To everyone who has helped me become the woman I am today, and to everyone who has shown me exactly what I did not want to become, she added, looking right at me. People in the room started to clap. Carolyn hugged Reginald, kissed her new father-in-law on the cheek, and enjoyed the compliments of 180 people who now knew just what kind of disappointment had raised her. I stayed there for 30 seconds, listening to the clapping stop. My daughter was so happy because she had embarrassed the man who had reared her in front of a lot of people. I saw her do it. Caroline didn't know what I had, so I reached into my jacket pocket. For 8 years, I saved money, waiting for the proper time to come forward and tell the truth. She was about to learn that some lessons cost more than others. I stood up slowly and quietly so I wouldn't make any noise. People were still talking, laughing at Caroline's remarks, and the sound of glasses clinking filled the room. But I wasn't paying attention to that. I was waiting for the quiet that would come at any moment. I moved a little closer to the microphone, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. I could hear Caroline's voice as I got closer, and her laughter was still echoing through the room. I was shocked to hear the person I had devoted my life to protecting laugh. That was the same person I had given up everything for. That night, I was no longer the shattered man in the corner. I was no longer the parent she thought was less than her. When I got to the stage, I could see the guests gazing at me and waiting for me to finish my speech because the microphone was in the appropriate place. They had no idea what was going to happen next. Caroline's face twisted into a look of fear and perplexity, something I hadn't seen in her in years. I, on the other hand, was not going to let her leave without a fight. I said in a strong, clear voice that reverberated through the auditorium, "Good evening, everyone." There was no sound in the room. I could sense the tension in the air, which was so thick that it felt like smoke. Everyone was staring at me now. Even though the focus was more stronger than I had expected, I was able to stay calm. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate Caroline and Reginald's wedding," I said. "It has taught me a lot." I let the words hang in the air for a moment so the crowd could take in what I had just said to start the discourse. Caroline was gripping her champagne glass so firmly that her knuckles turned white and her face turned pale. I could see all of this. Reginald had been the favorite child up to this point, but now he seemed bewildered and unsure of what was going on. He looked around. He probably thought he knew me well, but he was wrong. No one did that. "You know," I said, trying to keep my voice as hard as possible, "I've been sitting at table 12 tonight, listening to all the speeches about success and achievement, About rising above your circumstances and joining families with real breeding and class. I stopped and looked right at Whitman Sterling Jr. He didn't know this, so he didn't know that I was using this chance to get my story straight because of the false story that had been made up about me and to settle the score. I said, "It made me think of my late wife Margaret and what she would have thought of the party tonight." Caroline kept looking back and forth between me and the doors that would lead her to the exit. She was trying to figure out what I was up to, but she couldn't stop me from doing what I was doing. Reginald's grasp on her shoulder got tighter. He probably wanted to comfort her, but it felt like a vice. He thought something was wrong, but it was too late to help her. He has to save himself first. I continued in a gentler voice, "Margaret was an amazing woman. She taught kindergarten for 28 years and had an impact on the lives of hundreds of young children." I could see how the audience was responding. Even if the guests whispered sorrowful things, I wasn't come to get pity. I didn't come here to execute the duties of the widower who is grieving. She died 8 years ago after a long battle with cancer. We spent every penny we had trying to save her life. I stopped and looked Caroline straight in the eyes. My look had the same effect on her as a car. She had no idea this would happen. She assumed that embarrassing me in public wouldn't have any ramifications for her. But she was going to find out what real consequences looked like. I increased my voice and continued, "Caroline saw our savings go down as I wrote check after check to pay off doctors and hospitals. She assumed her father was spending all of his money on love. Her skin looked too pale for her to be normal. I could tell that the panic attack was starting. She knew what was going to happen, but I wasn't done yet. Caroline figured out that her father had lost all of his money after Margaret died. She thought he had no future, that he was a pathetic failure who had bet everything on treatments that hadn't worked." I continued, pausing for effect to let the entire weight of the situation sink in. "I let her believe that story for 8 years. I made her think I was having money problems, that I lived in a small apartment, drove a used car, and shopped at cheap places because I had no other choice. I saw several members of the Sterling family looking at each other as they realized they had made a mistake about me. Whitman Sterling Jr. looked like he had just eaten something that tasted bad. He had always been very proud of his ability to read people, but tonight he was the one being read. I let Caroline think she was dating above her station when she met Reginald. I said to make things clearer. That she was lucky to be accepted into a family with real money and real class. I took the phone out of my jacket pocket, where it was waiting to be used. I carefully took it out and said, "Before I go on, I think you all need to hear something." A recording of Margaret's voice made 3 days before she died. Something she asked me to tell other people about in case a certain sequence of events ever happened. Caroline suddenly stood up and said, "Dad, maybe we should sit down." "Caroline, you're wrong." I keep my voice calm and controlled, which makes it easy for me to cut through your resistance. "I think I have something to add to the conversation." I was able to connect Margaret's phone to the audio system by connecting the auxiliary connector to her phone and the venue's audio system. In the silent room, the phone's gentle click when it connected was nearly too loud to bear. This time, I started talking again, but this time I was talking about the truth, the cold, hard truth that Caroline had been hiding from. "You just gave a beautiful speech about how your mother died ashamed of me, how grateful you are to have found a real father figure in Whitman, and how you want to move on from the past. In my opinion, it's only fair that everyone gets to hear what your mother said about you in her last days." Caroline didn't move. She looked shocked, and her lips opened and closed as if she were trying to say something, but nothing came out. At this point, the room was very quiet. You could even hear a pin drop. When I hit the record button, the sound system in the reception hall made Margaret's voice louder, even though it was weak but determined. "Matt, if you hear this, I'm gone, and Caroline has probably gone too far, as I told you she would. Everyone in the room was holding their breath and waiting for something to happen. Everyone was really surprised by this. Margaret went on in her voice, "She's become cruel, Matt. Not only selfish, but also mean. Caroline asked me a question last week while the nurse was helping me to the bathroom. She wanted to know when I was going to die so that you could go back to your normal life." Those were the exact words she used. Everyone in the room could hear the gasps coming from all around them very clearly. At first, Caroline's face turned very pale, and then it turned green. She couldn't talk or move at all. She didn't know what to do in a situation like that. Caroline said in a voice so faint it was almost inaudible, "I can't believe this." She told me she was embarrassed to bring friends over because of how pathetic you had become, Margaret stated. Her voice echoed through the reception area without stopping or giving any pity. She said she wished she had been born into a different family, one that had done well, she said. At this point, the guests gasped out loud. They uneasily stared at each other. Reginald was grasping her shoulder, and his confusion was turning into pain. The Sterling family, who had looked down on me because I came from a working-class background, were staring into their champagne glasses, not knowing what to do. Margaret's voice got stronger as she stated, "I heard her on the phone with that Sterling boy, Matt." She laughed at the thought that her father, who hailed from a working-class background, would never be able to fit in with them. She thanked me for giving her intelligence, as it was clear that your genes were limited. Everyone in the room seemed to be suffering the same shock at that time. Their faces made it very plain. Caroline had been working hard for years to keep the truth a secret because she thought there was no way anyone would ever find out. But that night, the only thing that mattered was the truth. Whitman Sterling Jr.'s complexion had turned a nasty shade of gray, and Reginald had been shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Margaret said, "Matt, I'm scared," and her voice started to sound desperate and urgent. She doesn't dread death, she fears the change that is happening to her. Promise me that you won't give money to encourage this behavior when I'm gone. Promise me that you will make her earn her character the hard way. The recording stopped all of a sudden. You could hear individuals straining to breathe in the hushed room. At this point, Caroline was shaking. Her eyes were starting to fill with tears, and there were smudges of mascara on her cheeks. Not only was she being humiliated, but she was also being shown who she had become. I stopped for a moment to let everything that had just been spoken sink in. There was no turning back now that the truth had come out. It was no longer an 8-year-old's duty to keep this secret, it was a 100-pound burden. But I wasn't going to give up on this. I was done letting Caroline have any say in the plot. I turned to look at the other folks who had come. Some people were shocked, some were horrified, and some even felt sorry for me. I saw a little bit of the daughter I used to know for the first time in a long time. Caroline's face showed both anger and shame. The person who had not been corrupted by money and status, but none of that was true now. I kept talking after taking a deep breath, and the microphone made every word I said sound louder. I have done what Margaret wanted for the past 8 years, I said. I let Caroline have a hard time. Tell her we don't have any money. I watched her work hard to get what she wanted. I had hoped that she would learn the things that her mother valued, like being humble and caring for others. I added, instead, she became exactly what Margaret had been afraid of. I lowered my attention to the phone in my hand and stopped. Someone who thinks that having a lot of money is more important than being a good person. A person who would inflict shame on the dead in order to be accepted by others. Caroline's skin became increasingly paler. I cut her off before she could say anything. Caroline, I'm not done yet. At this point, everyone in the crowd was paying close attention to what was being said. There was no way to go back to how things used to be. I took my phone out of my pocket and opened the Chase Bank app. I've lived my life for 8 years as if I were a failure and had no money, I said. You may think that all the things I've done for you, like giving you money, help, and support, have come from nowhere. But I think it's time for you to face the truth about what's going on. I held the phone up high enough so that the people sitting at the tables in the front could see the screen. I said, my checking account has $33,187,432 in it right now. After a short break, the room got silent, and then people started to talk to each other in whispers. As Reginald tried to figure out what was going on, his face got redder and redder. Whitman Sterling Jr. looked like he might pass out right then and there. I used my phone to scroll to the next page. My military service record is in this document. I worked as a contractor for the Pentagon for 15 years, building cyber defense systems. I had top secret clearance. The job I finished in 2019 was the biggest single contractor award the military has ever given out. $47.5 million. I could hear the folks behind me gasp. They didn't know who I was or what I had truly done. The man who had been wronged, the one who had lost, had just broken the illusion they had made about me. I showed the group another paper. I said, this is the property deed for the estate at 247 Meadowbrook Lane in Greenwich, Connecticut. Some of you might know that address. The Sterling family has lived in their ancestral home, a 12-bedroom house, for 4 generations. Except for the fact that they don't own it. I looked right at Whitman Sterling Jr., and the people behind me did the same. His face lost all color. I do, I said. I bought it in 2009, the same year that your railroad wealth fell apart and you went bankrupt. You have been paying me $1 a year to rent it from me, which is part of a charitable agreement I made to help you save face. I had the strong impression that the room was changing in some way. The Sterling family's reputation was going down, and this was all because of their own hubris and belief that they were better than everyone else. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I went on to say, the property is now worth $8.2 million. I pay $63,000 in taxes every year, and I'm responsible for the upkeep, which costs about $40,000 a year. I walked back to Caroline and started talking to her again. Would you like to know about the other things I've been paying for? Her mascara had run down her face, and she was crying. She had been told about the fact, and she had no other way to defend herself. I started a new document on my phone. Anonymous cashier's checks totaling $87,000 over 6 years will be used to pay off your college loans. When your credit card reaches its limit, you must pay $43,000. You also pay $91,000 in security deposits and rental assistance for your apartment. You also pay $26,000 for your BMW X5, as well as insurance and maintenance. Caroline Thompson received a total of $247,000 in anonymous cash help over the course of 8 years. It was so silent in the room that it felt like it was there. Caroline's crying could still be heard, which made it impossible for me to stop talking. Finally, after 8 years of waiting, I was able to say the words I had been wanting to say out loud. I made sure that you never really failed. You battled just enough for me to believe that you were working hard to earn your pay every month, I remarked in a calm manner. And every month I prayed that you would grow into the person your mother wanted you to be. I stopped and looked around the room. The guests' faces had changed from sympathy to something else, something even worse. Reginald's face was twisted in surprise, and Whitman Sterling Jr. was staring at his wineglass as if it held the key to his future. This evening, you stepped on stage in front of 180 people and said that your mother died embarrassed of me. You then said that I had failed and that I had never done anything important. My voice dropped to a whisper, so quiet that it was impossible to hear. Caroline, your mother did not die ashamed of me. She died while she was still worried about you. Caroline fell into her chair because she couldn't hold back her cries any longer. My words hung in the air, and the seriousness of the situation kept everyone quiet. I looked at her hard, and my heart felt like it was made of stone. I softly said to myself, I don't know if you'll ever get it, but this is the last time I'm going to save you. From now on, you're on your own. After I finished speaking, the silence that followed was so thick and heavy that it almost suffocated me. The reception hall, which had been filled with music and laughter, was now eerily quiet. This silence was so creepy that it was more noticeable than any clap could ever be. Caroline's cries were the only noise that broke through the oppressive atmosphere. Her chest rose and fell as she fought to control her emotions. Just a few moments ago, Reginald's hand had been resting confidently on her shoulder. Now it hung by his side, completely lifeless. The self-assurance that he had when he first came in was gone by the time he left. He is no longer the golden boy who thought he was marrying into a better social class. I could now see through him and understand his true nature. He was a man who had gotten himself into a situation that was far over his head. Despite his wealth and rank, he did not have a true understanding of what it meant to be strong. He had not the slightest idea that fighting for something that is of great importance to you is what gives it meaning. It was now painfully apparent that Caroline had never actually recognized this fact either. I stepped back and looked at the people who had come to visit. They were probably already using their phones in secret to look up information about me, the Sterling family, and the truth that had just come to light. A few people were still sitting in shocked silence, unsure of what to do or say. They were all thinking about something, but none of them could have known how important this moment was or how big the revelation that had just happened was. 8 years, I said, breaking the silence. For 8 years, I have watched you live in a world of lies. For 8 years, I have been quiet, allowing you to believe that I was the disappointment you so desperately needed me to be. However, I was no longer able to continue doing it. I couldn't stand by and watch you treat your mother's memories in such a way. I could not stand by and watch you destroy the last remnant of self-respect that I had left inside of me. I looked down at my phone again. I kept going through the papers I had written in the past. There were still parts of the puzzle that needed to be put together and more truth that needed to be told. Caroline, you think this is just about money, don't you? I asked. You think this is just a show of how much I have, don't you? I replied, my voice rising a little as I replaced my calm with a suppressed anger. But that's not the point. It was never anything like that. It's about something much more important, integrity. A made-up character. And the duty that comes with each of them. I knew that the words I was saying had a lot of weight. They hung over the room like a thick cloud. Caroline had painted me as a father who was not only sad but also invisible, even though I was neither of those things. I owned a story and had a voice. Now, everyone in the room who had been watching her march around with her life laid out in front of them had heard it. Reginald, I said when I turned to face him. I don't know if you're still holding on to whatever concept you had of your new family, but I think it's time for you to learn the truth as well. Everything you thought you knew about this family, everything you thought was given to you on a silver platter, is only an illusion. Your wealth, your heritage, and all of your successes are built on lies and deception. For years, it has been my mission to keep this from going under. I lifted my hand to stop Reginald before he could say anything. Reginald, you're not in charge here anymore. The truth is the one who holds the power tonight. For a brief moment, I was able to catch a glimpse of the first real fracture that appeared in his facade. The carefully constructed facade that he had built around himself, which gave the impression of wealth and success and of being above it all, started to fall apart. He just stood there, paralyzed, with his lips moving but no words coming out of his mouth. He remained silent and did not say anything in return. There is no defense. The overwhelming burden of all that he had constructed, which was now caving in on him after a while of trying to get her act together, Caroline finally lifted her head. Her face was covered in makeup that had been ruined by the tears she had been trying so hard to hold back, and her eyes were bloodshot. I looked back at her, and she was shaking as she tried to find the right words to say. She worked very hard, but she couldn't come up with anything. She didn't have any more excuses left to use. There are no more lies to hide behind at this point in time. At one point in my life, Caroline, I would have done anything for you, I said, my voice getting lower and colder. But the world I had to give was not what you wanted. You wanted something different. An imitation of something. Something that is built on how things seem on the surface. I also let you pursue that dream. It was my happiness that you were worried about when you let me build this version of myself. All it did was make you cruel. I stopped and took a long, deep breath through my nose. This was the hardest step of all. I had been putting it off for a long time, but that night it caught up with me. I added softly, I think it's time for you to learn what your mother wanted you to learn all along, and then I looked Caroline in the eye. Life isn't about who can put on the biggest show or who has the most toys. What you choose to do is what matters most. The person you make. The people you choose to be when you think no one is watching you. Caroline, you have made your choice and it is final. You have shown everyone who you really are. Her face twisted into a look of shock and rage. You are wrong, Father. You don't have the power to do this. You don't have the right to. I may stop her calls at any time. You have earned that right, Caroline. I've been fighting for something real my whole life. For the sake of my family and for the sake of your mother. In the end, the only thing that matters is if you can look in the mirror and be proud of who you have become. Caroline stepped back, and her wrath was now as strong as her surprise. But I could see the fractures in her armor. I could feel her regret and the realization that she had lost something much more significant than anything she could ever expect to get back, even though she had done so much. I turned to face the audience and looked at the faces of the guests that were there. I think it's time for all of us to take a step back and realize something. When you lose the one thing that really matters, money, power, and position don't mean anything. When the lights go out, that's who you are. I stayed in the same position for a long time, letting the serenity last for a long period. The guests didn't know what to do next, so they just stood there. I didn't care anymore. Finally, the truth had been told. That was a win in and of itself. I kept talking, but I lowered my voice to a whisper. I have said everything I wanted to say. I have told you the truth. Now it's time for me to leave. I'm done with this place. After I turned my back to the microphone and spoke those things, I walked over to the door and started to leave the room. I heard Caroline's voice for the last time as I walked by. It was a loud, passionate wail that rang through the corridor. Please, Dad, she begged. Don't turn your back on me. We need to talk about some things. Still, I kept going. There was no way I could do it. After all those years of silence and letting her lie and be mean, the weight of those years was finally lifted from her shoulders. At that point, I realized that there was nothing left for me here. There was no need to wait any longer. There was no more pretending. The consequences were put into action and set in motion. From that point on, there was no going back. I left the sound of her words behind and stepped out into the bitter night. I knew I had done what I needed to do, and I would never regret it, no matter how much agony it gave me or how much it cost me. When I stepped out into the cold night, I felt a sense of clarity. It was as if the weight of years of silence had been lifted from my shoulders. Some lessons take a lot of work, but those are the ones that have the biggest effect on the people we become. As far as Caroline is concerned, I've done everything I can. She is in charge of everything else. This story isn't just about getting back at someone. It's about doing the right thing, no matter what. If you've made it this far, you've seen how powerful the truth can be and how the quietest people in the room can have the biggest impact. Thank you for taking the time to read this. If you learned something new today or want to hear more stories like this one in the future, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. I am very grateful for everything you do for me. Until we meet again, remember that the lessons that cost the most are often the ones that are the most valuable.